Welcome back, everybody. This is the last seminar of the school year for us. So we couldn't end it better, but with David Broockman from Berkeley, who is a professor of political science there, a department that is near and dear to my heart because that's where I got my PhD. But David used to be here at Stanford and then fled to the East Bay. And yes, we'll, but we'll try to, lay our talons into him while he's here today and take as much of his intellect as possible. He's going to be talking about ideology, idiosyncrasy, and instability in the American electorate. I'll say that David is not just, not just a normal scholar of American politics, but has done, the way I think about a lot of his scholarship is that it has sort of new methods, introduced sort of new ideas, new ways of studying American politics that I have really benefited from. And so he has worked in a number of areas that are relevant to the work we do here in the Cyber Policy Center. So I'm thrilled that he's here to talk to us today. As usual, those of you on Zoom, please put any questions into the Q&A. After a half hour or so of his talk, we will have a little conversation here, and your questions will magically appear on my cell phone as we are talking, but also folks in the room as well, questions at that time. So, Professor Broockman, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction, Nate. And I have to say, when I was here at Stanford, Nate was so supportive of me and continues to be to this day. And so I'm so grateful for that and for all the really such a provider of public goods in the discipline. And I know at Stanford as well. So thank you for that, and thank you for this kind invitation. So today we're going to be talking about this project that's co-authored with Ben Lauderdale at UCL in London. It's very much a project in progress, as you'll see. But the basic motivation for this project returns to, for those of you who know the political science literature, you'll know this stuff. For those of you who don't, I'm going to give you a crash course. Some kind of foundational questions that we've been asking about public opinion for quite a long time. So one is the question of, if we try to understand people's views on political issues, should we think of those views as largely kind of existing on this like left-right spectrum or not? It turns out that question has a lot of implications of, like, do you think people can be kind of boiled down to how left-wing or right-wing they are? For example, should we think about the people who look like they're in the middle as kind of moderate in the sense that, like, they want moderate policy? Or might they actually kind of have a mix of left-wing and right-wing views, and calling them moderates doesn't really accurately summarize where they are on individual issues? That really matters how you think about, like, how should candidates try to go win elections to win the votes of these people that seem moderate, for example. Another question you might have is, how extreme are voters? Do voters tend to kind of have more moderate views? How often do voters support policies that we might think of as outside the mainstream? Another related question that I'll talk about a lot in this talk is, okay, to what extent do voters actually have stable views on issues at all? One of the oldest kind of findings in the study of public opinion is that when they kind of first started doing studies in the 50s and 60s, surveys in the 50s and 60s, is if you ask people their views on even pretty basic policy questions, and then you go back to them in the weeks and months later, you ask them the same question again, their answers will often change. And we have a lot of different views about why this might be. One view is people are just kind of making things up as they go along, and they don't really have views at all. And there's others that I'll talk about. But this kind of finding, which still replicates to this day, there's a lot of instability in people's attitudes, often raises these foundational questions of, like, well, do people have these attitudes at all? And answering each of these questions, so I've given you 3 questions that might seem pretty unrelated. They're actually, I think, very deeply related to each other. Because, for example, how we measure people's issue views depends on how predictive we think one dimension is of them. So you can do things like think of measuring people's issue views like an SAT, where you should ask them a lot of questions about a lot of different things. You just want to figure out where they are on that left-right spectrum. On the other hand, if you think that one dimension doesn't predict them well, but there's a lot of measurement error, you should do other things. And so kind of figuring out these basic questions are all very interrelated. And so in this project, we're going to try to kind of address all these questions together. And part of how we're going to do that is to define these quantities, which I'll show you mathematically, which is to try to understand the share of voters' views overall and on individual issues that are explained by what we call, building on some of Ben's prior work, ideology, idiosyncrasy, and instability. I'm going to talk more about what those means in a minute. the findings here, and what I'm going to present today is actually based on some pilot data. We have some more representative data in the field. Generally, things don't change when you go do that, but they might, so caveat. Is that we find that these terms that I'll define of ideology, idiosyncrasy, instability are all really important and all explain about a third of the variation when people answer questions about policies. We find, though, that ideology, there's actually very few people for whom this left-right ideology is a majority of what gives rise to their views. And we show that this kind of ideology is very linked with knowledge of party positions, consistent with some other work that suggested that a lot of what drives the extent to which some people are actually more consistently liberal on across all the issues or consistently conservative. It's kind of adopting what their side believes. We also find that these people who are in the middle are actually the least ideological. So the people in the middle who have a mix of liberal and conservative views are actually, there's very few of them that we should think of as kind of centrist in an overall sense. They seem to be more kind of mixed across issues. We're going to show that there are people that have views that are on average more extreme. Those tend to be people who are not ideological or driven by their parties, but just very idiosyncratic. And we find, with respect to instability, which we also find lots of, that people's answers change, we find some interesting evidence that that instability is actually not reflective of people just making stuff up, but rather it's kind of sincere in the moment. That other things they say in that survey and do on that same day are kind of consistent with what they said. It's just when you ask them again a month later, they kind of come to a different view. So it's a kind of sincere in the moment view of why we're getting this instability. Okay, so that's where we're going. So to first give you some background on this, and there's going to be a little bit of math in this talk. I'll apologize to some of you. I'm going to start with this idea of ideology. So in this, there's a lot of ways to think about ideology. In this talk, the way we're going to think about it is just as a purely statistical construct, that it is a single dimension that predicts voters' views. So that's to say, I can give you a number, like Nate is a 2.7, and once I know Nate is a 2.7, ask me how Nate feels about a bunch of things, and I can give you a pretty good answer, at least a probability that he's going to answer those questions in those ways. When you do that, when you try to create, there's these models we have that try to estimate, Nate's a 2.7, I'm a -1, or whatever it is. We estimate that about 70% of the variation in what people say kind of can't be predicted based on their ideology. And that error term, though, explains, it would include a couple things. Part of what might not be explicable is instability, which is to say this part of your opinions, which is kind of just unstable, and so it's kind of not really something real that's persistent about you. Part of it might be, though, what we're calling idiosyncrasy, which is opinions you have that are real opinions, that are persistent over time. You would keep telling us you have that opinion again and again. It's just not consistent with your left-right ideology. So you might be a conservative who is really pro-choice. And every time we ask you, you answer all the other questions in the conservative way, and you keep saying, but I am liberal on abortion. That would be a kind of idiosyncratic opinion in our parlance. There's a lot of debates about how to interpret what this error term is. As I mentioned, and for time, I'll skip over some of this, and that's part of what we're trying to speak to here. And as an example of why understanding, well, how much of that error term is kind of this idiosyncrasy or this instability, the methodological stakes here are pretty important, as I was mentioning, of how these things are all related. If we think this instability component is meaningful, then we kind of can't take professed views on one question at one point in time very seriously. On the other hand, if we think this instability is really rare and idiosyncrasy is a lot of what's going on, then we can. And so these kind of questions about how much is ideology, idiosyncrasy, instability, has pretty foundational implications for how we think about measuring any of the stuff that we study in public opinion. And I'll just give you examples of a substantive stakes here of why does this question matter for how we understand the world, not just how we study it. So imagine that idiosyncrasy is rare. If so, what we can do is say, okay, if when people are answering these questions, we're getting noise plus just a signal of how left or right wing they are, then we can just do what I was mentioning earlier and think of political surveys as like an SAT. We can ask you a lot of questions about a lot of different policies, abortion, gay marriage, taxes, and really all of those questions are doing is giving us a window and a better estimate of your underlying left-right ideology. Just like an SAT, we think, okay, we have all these math questions, and really what they're doing is trying to understand this underlying thing of just how good are you at math. So we can think of ideology like that. And in fact, the kind of statistical tools that are used for grading the SAT and in this literature are actually the same. So and if that holds, then that really has big implications for how we think about the people in the middle, which is where most people are. Because if we think about people who give us a mix of liberal and conservative views, one way to think about them, and a lot of the literature does think about them this way, is, well, they're giving us that mix of views because they're trying to express that they're in the middle. And so if we could really measure and kind of measure what's in their brain on any given issue, what they would want is centrist policy. They just are, they're the kind of, New York Times opinion, centrist space, or the Wall Street Journal opinion centrist, whoever it is. Or Niskanen Center, I guess, is maybe the best one. There's few left, but apparently many people think there's a lot in the electorate. And on the other hand, politicians, though, they have almost all liberal or all conservative votes. And so if you try to then say, okay, well, there's a lot of work doing this, let's try to put everyone on one dimension, you would find, well, the politicians are really extreme, but all the voters are really moderate. And so what should we therefore do? Well, we got to return power to voters because they're all going to want really moderate stuff. On the other hand, suppose that's not true. Suppose that idiosyncrasy is meaningful and that this stuff that ideology doesn't predict is actually real opinions people have. Well, then just because someone has a mix of liberal and conservative views doesn't necessarily mean that they are actually centrist on individual issues. And we don't know how extreme legislator or voters' ideal policies are from just asking them a bunch of questions and saying, well, you're in the middle. We can't kind of infer where you are on taxes from the fact that you're liberal and conservative on half of issues. We have to actually ask you what you think about taxes. And there's a lot of literature that basically argues, you don't need to ask people about individual issues. We can just do this, kind of figure out this left-right summary. As just one example of how this could really change how we understand representation, this is from a paper I have from a few years ago. This is actually before Adam Schiff was famous. We used some survey respondents in his district as an example. There was this survey done, the CCS, which asked people how they would vote on a bunch of issues. If you look across those issues, there's a majority in favor of the liberal view on every single one of those issues. And Adam Schiff also voted with the majority in a liberal way on every issue. So one way to look at this is a liberal district, and Adam Schiff is voting in a liberal way on every issue. If you take the view that, look, ideology is really what kind of public opinion is all about, and this is what a lot of these papers out there in the literature do, then you would say Adam Schiff is not representing his district correctly by voting with the majority on every issue. How would you come to that conclusion? Because you would say, well, if we kind of boil down all the voters to one dimension, and we boil down Adam Schiff to one dimension, notice that none of the individual voters are as consistently liberal as he is. And so we would say, look, Adam Schiff is too extreme. He needs to pick an issue, it doesn't matter which one, to vote against the majority. That way he'll represent his district better. So a lot of these findings that politicians are out of touch are literally generated from this idea. And if you believe that ideology is really all there is to public opinion, then this example isn't so crazy. But if you believe, because part of what you could believe is going on here is well, yes, people support these policies on average, but really their ideal policy is much closer to the center. And so Adam Schiff should act in a way where he kind of rejects some of these policies that are moving policies, say maybe from the far right to the far left. Okay, I'm going to go over this part quickly just for time, but just as an example of this is a very active debate. There's a recent paper published in our discipline's top journal by a bunch of very distinguished scholars, where they're kind of trying to understand how to kind of deal with this issue, and they articulate this goal, which is very interesting, which we're going to try to take up as well, which is to say, well, maybe some voters are not so ideological, and kind of pose this kind of problem that I was showing you on the last slide. And so maybe one of the things we could do is figure out at a voter by voter level who's ideological enough we can do the thing we want to do, which is boil you down to one dimension, and who's maybe not ideological enough. So that's the basic idea. And that way, when we want to figure out what you think on individual issues from your overall ideology, we can just look at the people who are ideological enough that we can do that, and then kind of set aside the people who are the kind of weird, they really have a mix of left and right-wing views. And what they find is, the vast majority of people are ideological enough that you can do this kind of left and right-wing scaling with, and when you use that procedure, they're all really close to the middle. And by the way, those people matter a lot. They're very central to electoral change. And so we should really think about what drives elections. It's these kind of people in the middle, these kind of moderates. Ben and I have a critique of their article, arguing that what they're trying to do is basically a form of magic. They're trying to say that without repeated observations of the same people over time, which is what the data that we have will show you, there's a way we can figure out that error term that I showed you, how much of that is kind of instability, like answers that would change, and how much of it is actual genuine opinion, without ever measuring whether those answers change, asking them again. The way they do this is with a very restrictive assumption, which is assuming there's only one way to be a non-ideologue. So as one example of this, in some generated data that we applied their model to, we imagine that we're in a very simple world where there's not lots of different dimensions like taxes, abortion, gay marriage, but just two. And if there's two dimensions, and then you feed that kind of give rise to people's views, and you feed that data to the model in this paper, what the model says is, well, there's this little cluster over there of non-ideologues, but everybody else can be fit really well. And the key issue that you can see arising in this paper is if you look in the top left, I would say they correctly categorized that group as non-ideologues. And why is that? Because if you just say, well, they're kind of in the middle, it doesn't really capture the fact that actually they're kind of to the left on dimension 1 and to the right or the top on dimension 2. So you can't really accurately summarize those people in the top left by saying they're left-wing or right-wing, and they're left-wing on one issue and right-wing on the other. The issue with the method is it doesn't make the same correct inference for the folks on the bottom right. So the folks close to that line, they're all folks who, their views on one issue is very predictive of their views on the other. If they're conservative on one, they're conservative on the other. But the people far from that line, it's only able to pick kind of one cluster of people. And so that's the kind of key issue with that method is in order to kind of do the magic it's saying it can do, it relies on this assumption there's only one way to be non-ideological. Okay, so and basically what's going on, we think, is that essentially their method draws a line and then picks a point, and it says there's more people close to the line than the point. And I think the issue here is not an issue of politics, it's an issue of geometry, that a line is bigger than a point, and so they basically in every data set we've looked at will always say there's more dots closer to the line than the point. Okay, so we think, we really actually like and I think this paper is actually very transformative, though, for articulating this goal, which I had not thought of before, which is to say, well, let's try to go to individuals and think about how ideological are they. And so that's what we're going to try to do and kind of take up that task in our paper, but we think we need some slightly different tools to do it. One is panel data, which is to say data where we ask the same people the same questions over time. We need that kind of data because without it, we can't tell whether those kind of answers people give that don't seem consistent with their ideology are kind of real, genuine opinions they hold or not. And the fact that they don't have this data is what forces the authors of this paper to rely on this kind of this assumption that there's only one way that voters could not be ideological. The other is that their data relies on these binary questions. And it's hard so if you just ask people, for example, do you think we should raise taxes on the rich from 37% to 50%? You can't really use those questions to figure out how extreme someone is, right? Maybe someone says no to that question because they are happy with the way things are at 37. Maybe they say no because they want to lower taxes to 20. Maybe they want to lower it to 0. Or maybe they say yes because they think 50 is good. Maybe they say yes and they want to raise it to 90, right? Just a binary question basically cuts the an issue space in two, and you don't really know where people are in it. So they're forced to rely on this one-dimensional ideology to figure out how liberal or conservative people are on an issue, precisely because the individual issue questions they have don't let them figure that out for issues. So they don't give voters the option to say whether they're extreme or moderate or not. They try to infer that statistically. And so our idea is, why don't we just let voters tell us that directly? And so what we're going to do is come up with a model in panel data that allows for these kind of non-binary questions. So the way we're going to do that, the way this model works, is we, without getting into too much detail, we've made a kind of very slight change to the math that I showed you earlier, and for time I'm not going to get into this too deeply here, but the key term we've added, so if you look in the second bullet where I have that equation, yijt, so you notice, so I is indexing individuals, j is indexing issues, and t is indexing time. So we're trying to model people's view, how they respond to individual issue questions, and we have data at the level of an individual, an issue, and time. And the key thing we've done, so the first term here, the beta j theta I, that's capturing ideology. So there's some mapping specific to each issue j between a person's ideology, theta I, and then their response. The second term, this is what we're adding here. There's a term that does not index by time. That term, I forget which Greek letter that is now. That term, that second term, you can think of like a fixed effect or like a random effect. We do both, which is the persistent part of your opinion, which is different than what we'd expect based on your ideology. But it's not indexed by time because it's persistent over time. And in the last term, this error term, this is indexed by time. You can think of this as the instability parameter. This is the part of your opinion that when we ask you the same question over time, kind of every time it kind of bounces around and different than the average of what you said on the other waves. So what we're going to try to do is ask, well, how much of opinion is explained by basically these three terms in that equation? I'm going to skip over this mathematical part here and just say that's the basics of what we're trying to do. We have some data, again, as I mentioned, this is pilot data gathered on the survey platform Lucid in late 2023. We have a more representative sample in the field now. And what we did is, in the basic data we have, so we have 3 panel waves. We have 18 issue questions we asked everybody, and each question has 7 options. And so the way that these options work, and this built on some of my prior work, is we allow people to express views that are both more moderate than the parties. So that would be at 4 on these scales. We've placed the parties. We tried to have basically research assistants go try to figure out, like, well, what are the flanks of the parties in Congress saying? What are the typical kind of median Democrats and median Republicans in Congress saying? And we also give people options that are more extreme. So the 1 and the 7 options here are the kind of too extreme for basically anybody in Congress on one side or another. And so part of what we're interested in here is, well, how often do people pick the answers around 3, 4, and 5, which is kind of in the mainstream versus outside the mainstream? So that's part of what we're trying to do. Here's an example question on healthcare, and we've actually updated this since, but you can see we start off all the way at 1 is the government should employ doctors directly. This is like the UK system. On the other hand, you can go all the way to 7, really conservative policy. The government should get out of this. And then in the middle are kind of gradations of where you could be. So people answered 18 questions like this. Okay, so when they answer those questions, on average, where do they end up? And again, this is pilot data, so I don't want to make too much of this, but this just gives you a sense of what this looks like. There are some issues. So take affirmative action, for example, the second one, where one party, so like the Republican Party, there's a lot of support that lines up on the Republican position on affirmative action. And a lot of other surveys show this too, like the Democratic position on affirmative action, not very popular. On the other hand, move over just 1 to birth control. People don't really like where the Republican Party is going on birth control. They kind of like the Democratic position on birth control. There's others like climate change where people seem to really line up where their parties are. There's others where maybe people do look like they're more in the middle, like crime and police. People say, yeah, I don't really like what either party's doing on crime and police. I kind of want to chart a middle course. And so you see this heterogeneity across issues where it seems to really depend. I don't want to, again, make too much of what we found in this non-representative survey, but gives you a feel for the patterns here. Okay, the real new thing in this data, though, is what we can do with individuals. And so in these plots, what we've shown you is, so every one of the little squares is one answer that one person gave to one question. And within each kind of oblong rectangle, we're showing you how their answers changed across the 3 waves of the survey we did. And so this is an example of one of the respondents who's the most typical in terms of these quantities that we define of ideology, idiosyncrasy, and instability. And you can see that this person's kind of center left, and so on average their responses are clustering around the center left. And so you can see there's some ideology here, but there's also a fair amount of idiosyncrasy and also a fair amount of instability. So on issues of gay rights, for example, this person is really stable. They gave the exact same answer every time. On the other hand, if you look towards the union issue, which is the 4th issue, this person doesn't seem to have very firm views about unions. The first time they give us the kind of democratic response, the next time they give us a pretty conservative response, the next time they give us a moderate response. This is kind of what public opinion data tends to look like. On some issues, people are more stable. On some, they bounce around. This is another person who's another one of the most typical respondents, also center left, but the issues that, they, on the other hand, on unions, they're very stable. So on the fourth issue here, unions, their views, they are kind of conservative on unions. They stick to that despite the fact that they are center-left on average on everything else. Like, this person seems to be pretty consistently telling us like they have a pretty right-wing view on unions. On other issues, though, they kind of bounce around. Affirmative action, they went from really left-wing to kind of more Republican. Again, this tends to be kind of how public opinion data looks. Now, those are the most typical respondents, but there's some respondents that look very different. This is the respondent who's the highest in ideology. So this person is like super ideological. This is the way that if everybody looked like this, those left-right ideological models would work great. 71% of the variation in what they say we can predict based on this left-right ideological model. They basically stick to being kind of a progressive, on the progressive left like all the time, and they really don't deviate from that in any meaningful way. Some people are really idiosyncratic. This is the most idiosyncratic person in the data. They're not ideological at all. Like, I don't know how, you can't really say this person is left-wing or right-wing, but they really know what they think, right? Every single time they give us the same answer, right? You know, there's one time on guns, they move a little bit in the last survey, and minimum wage, they're moving a tiny bit, but man, this person's like really, really stable. And then here's the most unstable person. And so they're all over the place. And I think likely, we don't mock people too much. Like, likely this is just someone who's not paying attention to the survey. And we do have those people. If you count it up, there's actually the same number of end-to-end moves as issue positions that remain the same. And we did randomize in every question every time you see it, whether it goes from liberal to conservative or conservative to liberal. So this could be consistent with like you just pick the first option every time and like click through the survey quickly. Okay. So some sanity checks of like, does this model we have work? So one is, this is a correlation matrix of looking at the wave 1 and wave 2 data among the part of the sample that our model says are the most ideological. And you can see that basically if you look at the average correlations between what people said the first time they took the survey and the second time they took the survey, the correlations across issues are kind of meaningful. It's stronger within issues. So, for example, the bottom left square shows that there is it's very small, a 0.72 correlation between what you said on healthcare at the first wave and healthcare at the next wave in this group. But the people who, those same people, they're pretty ideological. So what they said at healthcare on the first wave and what they said on, for example, crime and policing at the next wave is also pretty correlated because these people are more ideological. On the other hand, the half of the sample that's less ideological, you can't really do that. There's pretty decent correlations of what they say within issues over time, but across issues, not so much. Okay, so what can we sort of do with this data? So one of the things we can do is just try to characterize, first of all, how much kind of ideology, idiosyncrasy, and instability is there in this sample. We estimate it's about 30% of the variation can be predicted based on left-right ideology. That's actually slightly high based on kind of other estimates from prior studies. It could be this sample, it could be the questions we asked. The plot is not showing up great on the screen in the room, but this is a ternary plot that shows you kind of a cloud of these three quantities and where people end up. And you can see that there's actually a kind of a lot of diversity here in kind of how ideological, idiosyncratic, or unstable people are. And so what I want to do now is show you a few results where we actually look at that variation in ideology, idiosyncrasy, and instability and ask kind of where does it come from. So first, ideology. This is the kind of what the distribution of estimated ideology, what percent of people's responses is estimated ideology looks like. Some people are not very ideological at all, and then remember I showed you the person at the very top end of that tail, super ideological, right? And a lot of people are kind of somewhere in this 20 to 30% range. When we try to predict who is most ideological, the thing that pops really, really strongly is your amount of knowledge about politics. The people who are really knowledgeable about politics, they just know questions like, what's the veto override threshold in the House and Senate? Or, who's the Chief Justice? The people who know this stuff are really ideological. And that kind of meshes with a lot of traditional public opinion work that what is ideology? It is knowing, kind of being exposed to elite discourse and kind of being pulled into one of the party's kind of bins. It's consistent with this idea from some other work that suggests that, in some sense, this other work argues that there's no such thing as genuine public opinion outside of kind of people parroting what their party has to say. Well, we don't totally agree with that, though, right? Because we're finding that, yes, ideology is there, but that's a view of the world that says there's only ideology and then instability. And we actually find there's a lot of idiosyncrasy as well, which I'll get back to in a moment. Another thing you can do with this is you can ask, well, how many of these people are these kind of moderates that, because they are in the middle of an ideological score, we can infer that they are centrist on policy issues. And so what we can do is to get a sense of how many people are cross-pressured, that's to say they have a mix of left or right-wing views, versus how many of them are actually moderate or centrist on individual issues. What we can do is split voters by their estimated ideal point, which is to say left-right ideology, and ask, well, which source of the variation in their views is the largest share? And the people on the right are the people who don't consistently give us left or right-wing answers. And those people are actually disproportionately less ideological than everybody else. So if you wanted to use one of these kind of left-right measures to figure out people's views on individual issues, the people in the middle are actually the worst people to do that with. The people in the middle are the people for whom that left-right ideological score says the least about what they think about individual issues. So don't use left-right ideological scores to measure this. I'm gonna just skip these for time. Okay, the next thing I want to look at is to study floating voters. So here what we're going to do, we ask people how they voted in the last 3 presidential elections. It would be great if we had data going back to those elections to ask them at the time. Unfortunately, we don't, so this is kind of a proxy for that. And we ask, well, who are the kinds of people that change their views over the course of elections? And it turns out that all 3 of these kind of ideal types of the ideological people, the unstable people, the idiosyncratic people can change their votes. Some people are maybe really unstable. They're very fickle or mercurial, and maybe they change their issue views and they change which parties they want to vote for. Some people are more ideological and change their votes, and they say they are thinking about maybe things more ideologically. And the people who are more idiosyncratic and some more cross-pressured, they are also changing their votes too. So I think there's a lot of effort in political campaigns and in Washington to say, well, we need to profile the swing voter. Who is this person? And so one message of this project is there is no one answer to that question. They come in many flavors. Some of them are just really unstable. They don't have firm views. Some of them really do have firm views, but they're not that ideological. Some of them maybe are more ideological. Okay, next idiosyncrasy. So I'm going to talk about this briefly. The biggest predictor in our data of having these kind of opinions that are real but are not kind of tied to left or right ideology is having views that are more extreme. So when you express views that are outside the mainstream, you say like, I want a UK-style healthcare system, or I want to ban the use of race in admissions, or whatever it is. When you express views like that, a lot of people, I have some prior work arguing like, hey, these views are not that uncommon. And I've got a lot of pushback saying like, oh, there's no way that those views are real. Like if you ask people those questions again, they would never give you the same responses. In fact, actually, what we're finding here is people do tend to give those same extreme responses again. It's just that those responses don't line up well with their ideology. And so when we try to predict the extremity of people's responses, we can see a great predictor is how idiosyncratic they are. So the people who have so if we just try to predict the extremity of their average view, where kind of 1 would be like you're giving us the kind of party's position, the people who are more idiosyncratic, they're the ones, they have firm views, they're just not very ideological. So the people who are giving us extreme views are not just making stuff up, they're saying the same thing, it's just the things they're saying don't line up with one party. And I think that kind of makes sense, right? If you're a partisan Democrat, you don't tell us that you think the Democrats need to be 5 times more left-wing. If you're a partisan Republican, you don't tell us you think the Republicans need to be 5 times more conservative. You say what they're doing right now is awesome. And so the people, I think it makes sense that the people who have extreme views are kind of more idiosyncratic. They're not defined by ideology, but those views are real. Okay. Last thing I'm going to show you is instability. Some of this instability is a feature of nearly all voters. Converse, the kind of one of the founding essays of public opinion, argues basically there's kind of 2 types of people. There's people who have real views on issues and there's people who don't. He calls this the black and white model. There's a small number of people who have views on issues, everybody else doesn't. We don't find anything like that. It's actually, this kind of instability is a feature of basically everybody. And I think that makes sense, right? Even if I reflect on myself, like to think I have thought through a bunch of political issues, but on any given day, like you ask me, should we have a public option or not? Like, I don't know, like I might have a different view just because it's a hard question and different things come to mind. Some of this instability is no doubt driven by just kind of the artifact of surveys, people not paying attention. The people who fail attention checks are more unstable, but even the people who don't and seem like they're paying attention, there's also a fair amount of instability there. One last result I want to present, which is something that we're hoping to expand in the next version of this project, which I think is really fun and kind of wild, is, well, how should we think about what this instability is? So one view of what this is measurement error, which means that basically, like, you actually have a firm view on healthcare policy. It's not changing. And what's hard is kind of mapping that view you have to a question. And if you think about the kind of really early days of surveys, I think this is particularly plausible. In the American National Election Studies, when a lot of these theories were hatched, in that data, the questions voters are asked are questions that look like, okay, on a 1 to 7 scale, where we're trying to make a trade-off between protecting the environment and protecting jobs, where are you? And if you, say, bounce around between 1, 2, and 3, we would say, oh, look, you're really unstable, you don't have an opinion. It might also just be like, that question doesn't mean anything. And so people move around because it's like the measurement error is in the fact that, like, the questions are kind of vague. These questions are not that vague, they're still instability, but you could imagine that same psychological intuition applies, that, like, mapping your view to the question is kind of hard. You're maybe in between two of the points, you're trying to figure out how to slot in your view to fit into one of these bins we've defined, et cetera. So another view of it, though, and this is a view dating back to I think especially most associated with kind of John Zahler and Feldman, what they argue is, well, this measurement error is actually a little bit different. It's not that you have a firm view that you're trying to map to the question. It's that when we ask you the question, you're kind of creating your opinion on the spot, because you're not walking around with, like, a view in your head about what ideal healthcare policy is. You've got to be like, oh, healthcare, like, what do I think about that? And then when you make that decision in the moment, it is sincere in the moment. And now you say, like, well, now I've decided how I feel about this thing for, now or the next 5 minutes or today. But if you ask me again in a month, like, I might kind of redo that process again and come up with a different view. That is also my view at that time, and it's sincere. And it's not the fact that I'm, like, answering the question, carelessly or with error or having a hard time mapping what I think. It's just I think something else now because I've thought about it again. And so our evidence is actually interestingly consistent with that latter view of what's going on. So we are going to get some more evidence on this from some other methods, but I just want to show you this result, which I think is kind of fun. So we did what's called a conjoint study, which is very common in political science. It's actually my first time doing one of these. We basically give people these matchups between hypothetical candidates. And we say, okay, here's the candidate's views on 3 different issues. Which candidate would you vote for? And of course, these are the options that we used on our policy questions. And then what you're going to do, we know what people said on our survey. They think the ideal policy is on each of those policies. We're going to say, well, how does their answers to what they think correspond with whether they picked the candidate that said, say, those things are things that are more or less similar. So in this regression, we have the data defined at the level of the voter candidate issue. So every row is the voter said this on a policy, the candidate said this on the policy, and then we can say, okay, well, what's the distance? So, like, distance of 0 would be, the voter and the candidate said the same thing, and then we ask, did the voter choose the candidate or not? And so the first column, the first regression, just shows you the simple thing, which is, kind of no surprise, the further away the voter's expressed view and the candidate's view is, the less likely the voter is to pick that candidate. Okay, makes sense. Next thing, which I just want to put in here because of all of the comments and peer reviews I've received over the years telling me that these extreme views I've measured are not real, we can say, well, the views that people express that are further from the center, do those views get less weight? Are they, like, not real? And the answer is no. People think of their moderate and their extreme views just the same. They get just as much weight when people are choosing candidates. The next, now what we're going to do is take that first coefficient and split it up into, in this case, we've actually estimated, not just at the person level, but person by issue, how ideological, idiosyncratic, or unstable their view on that issue is. So if you remember, like, I showed you that guy with, like, the really solid, rock solid views on unions. They were very idiosyncratic, but they were very firm, right? And that's to say, I should say, stable over time. That would be someone who that's a very idiosyncratic view, but that same person had other views that were more ideological and other views that were more unstable. So we have that quantity defined at this voter by issue level. So we know how ideological or how idiosyncratic are your views. We have an estimate of that. And then we ask, well, this distance that is predicting people's choices, how much of this distance is kind of driven by the issues on which people's views are more ideological or more idiosyncratic or more unstable? And the answer is that all three of these components of people's views matter to people. The ideological component might actually matter a little bit more to people. Perhaps like when you know what your party's position is on an issue, you might like come to think it's more important. But actually these other views that people express, like they matter to them too. That's kind of a little bit surprising when it comes to the unstable aspect of people's views, right? Because if you think this instability is just measurement error, like because we're really getting at the aspect of your attitudes here that are unstable over time, and to say you are putting weight on that, well, what does that even mean? To say like the part of your attitudes which we put in the error term that we think are not real, you care about it. Like what could that possibly mean? Well, one way to get a sense of this, so we put this little candidate choice exercise at the beginning of the third wave of the survey. And when you look, you can see that basically all of that weight that is coming from that instability term is being driven by what you said on that third wave. So basically, you do this candidate kind of choice thing first. It seems like that kind of leads you to reflect a little bit about like, well, what do I think about healthcare policy today? And you tell us that later. And so there's something about like sincere in the moment opinion that seems to be going on here. Okay. I don't have much time left, so I'll just briefly conclude to say, what do I think the implications of this? I know this is some ways a very in-the-weeds talk. I think it gets at the foundational issues. One is that I don't think we should think of swing voters as moderate in a general sense. Even in the rare cases when they are, the fact that they're moderate ideologically, this is some stuff I skipped over, is not actually even the same as being moderate on individual issues. Consistent with past research, ideology seems to be driven by knowledge of party positions. And there's some evidence here suggesting that unstable opinions are at least partly genuine in the moment. We also seem to find that extreme views are real, common, and largely non-ideological. And my view is that what this kind of says broadly is that the extent of this kind of disconnect between voters and politicians is like a little bit overstated. That if you look on a typical issue, for example, something like 35% of opinion is to the left of Democrats. And again, this is not a representative sample. Something maybe like 20% of opinion is to the right of Republicans. And so it's not as if kind of all voters are sitting there in the middle and there's no voters who want politicians to get more extreme. There are plenty of them. On any given issue, the median view is typically close to pretty moderate. So I want to be clear here. I'm not saying like everybody wants left-wing policy on some issues, everyone wants right-wing policies on others. So like politicians actually have a really hard job. There is a diversity of opinion in this country on a lot of issues, and but on most issues though, politicians are on average not actually taking positions that are kind of consistent with the extremes on either side. So we have more work to do. We're getting better data. We have kind of more refined versions of the questions than we used here. But that's this project, and I'm looking forward to your comments.
Well, thank you so much. There's a lot to chew on there, and we've got about 20 minutes. So I want people raise your hands if you have questions. I'm going to start off with I don't know. This is my. You can decide whether I'm being a psychotherapist or a philosopher here and asking this question, which is like, if I asked you the question whether Americans are polarized, how would you define my question, and what would your answer be?
Yeah. So it's so funny. So. This term polarization, I think, is such a watchword, and I think it's actually interesting, I think, psychologically to think about in the discourse why this has become such a watchword for all of us right now. We both, I think, do a lot of work on polarization. We care about it, but I think broadly, people feel like there's some bad things happening in the country. Polarization is a word with a negative connotation, and so we think, okay, well, I think part of it is that we think, well, this metaphor like might help us explain what's going on. But as your question gets at, if you dig into that, there's a lot of different ways you could define what that is. The kind of most latest version of polarization that there's been, I think, the most interest in over the last 5 to 10 years is this idea of affective polarization, which is you ask people, how much you like or dislike the other party? People are saying more and more they dislike the other party. The U.S. is not a huge outlier in terms of kind of people's answers to that question. There's some countries where it's worse. There's some where it's better. That has gotten quote unquote worse in the U.S. I think it's a little bit. My view. I'm a little more heterodox on. I think it's a little bit unclear to what extent that matters or what it means. I think there's a way to interpret some of that affective polarization as just reflecting increased knowledge, that people know more about politics, they learn the stuff the other side is doing, they learn they don't like it, and they say, oh, well, I know I don't like those people now. And it's hard for me to look at a process like that and say, well, that's bad. It does seem like part of it is probably also more hostile rhetoric and stuff like that.
So let's focus on ideological polarization then, because part of what you're going to say is that maybe we are, polarized by. Actually, I don't even know how you would say that. I was going to say polarized by issues, but not ideology.
Yeah.
But even that's not true, because as you showed before, on any given issue, maybe there's a bell-shaped distribution.
Yeah, I think with respect to this project. So ending my big picture. I think the view. What this project to me suggests is that there's kind of different flavors of ways people might be polarized, or I don't know, alienated maybe would be another term, right? I think there's plenty of people, right, for whom they tend to think what their party is doing is great. And so the way in which they are polarized is I guess the sense that like kind of their opinions are like really lining up with one side, and there's and then there's people on the other side who also think what the other party is doing is great. So I think that 30% or something of the public, I think you could kind of fit cleanly within the kind of polarization box.
So we in your response there, and to some extent in the talk, you start introducing the idea of party, which is not necessarily what you're trying to measure here, because you're looking at issues and ideology. And so that's kind of where I want to go, which is to really understand how this might interact with party identification or preferences related to parties and things like that. I remember actually out of your department years ago, there was this a book by Ray Wolfinger and all of his graduate students called The Myth of the Independent Voter, right? Which I think the basic findings are consistent, I think, with what you've got here, but the whole idea was that really most independent voters are closet ideologues or closet party identifiers, right? So that someone who says they're independent but that there are weak. Then you ask them again, well, who do you prefer, the Democrats or Republicans? If they're an independent that then follows up with that question and says, I prefer the Democrats, those people are basically just like partisans, was part of the argument. Now, what you seem to suggest is, no, there's just a lot of, chaos in that middle group. But you're looking at it on the ideology side, and I'm wondering, like, is this a party explanation, or how should we think about the relationship of this with party identification and preferences for parties and candidates?
Yeah, I mean, my sense of like kind of combining our evidence with the other evidence is that for the people who are really ideological and really line up with one party, that it probably is a story of them kind of adopting their party's positions. With that said,
what share of that? So how big are those groups?
So this is part of what makes it a little tricky is that, I can put back up the slide where we showed kind of percent ideology. Oh, actually I can't. Let's see if we can put that back up. I'll go way back. I think there's so like this is just like the density plot of kind of percent of opinion that's ideological. So like there is an upper tail there where, over half the variation of what people say is kind of very consistent with, basically one party or the other, and it's all lining up left wing or right wing. But, most people are in this ground where I'm not sure whether we kind of would include them in a binary categorization or not, right? We're like, some of their views are definitely this way, but then they have other views that are, don't line up exactly. And so I'm not sure which way to bin those people. I do think for those people, though, I guess one of the things this project would suggest is just to not forget that they have all these other views that are also real for them that don't line up so neatly. And I think a lot of the literature and public opinion over the last 10, 20 years has really sort of said, well, there's this opinion people have that where they're just, following their party and like that's all there is. And so we're trying to point out is, no, people do have genuine other views that don't line up with their party. That's, that's not the only thing they have, but that's there, that kind of idiosyncrasy.
Well, but also that maybe the connection between their views on issues and either party preferences or candidate preferences is not as tight as we might think.
Yeah, I think this is one of those questions of, to what extent does people's issue views cause their partisanship and policy views versus the other way around? I think the answer is kind of clearly some of both.
Yeah,
and so I think it's a very hard question. I think we don't really know how to apportion to what extent that relationship flows in one direction or the other.
This is the reason, to the extent there's instability
Yeah.
on the issue items, would you expect instability in voting patterns among those groups, or is it totally irrelevant to the way that they're voting or what candidates or parties they prefer? Because that's what people often are going to care about here, right? Is like, well, leave aside prediction for a second, but just like how whether the your big insight here then is, if you're advising a campaign, what do you tell them? I mean, because if these people are going to vote for Trump or Biden anyway, regardless of how unstable their views are, then maybe we don't care as much. But if they're movable on the vote choice, not on their issues, that would be a different world.
Yeah, and I think that this is really consistent with this idea of cross pressure, which I think has fallen out of fashion, but I do think is very real. That there are in fact plenty of people who might kind of be on one side of the spectrum on a bunch of issues, but then have some other issue positions that don't line up with that. And if you put people all on one line, it's not really compatible with the idea that you could be, kind of conservative on some issues and liberal on the others. But I think that those people are actually real, and that's almost basically everybody has some of those issues where they are kind of cross-pressured. And so I think that's what I would be thinking if I was a campaign, is I would be thinking, okay, well, and I think this is how campaigns think, is it's not just about, reaching out to the middle in some broad, vague way. Like there's some of that, but I think there's also a lot of, well, what are the kind of the specific issues where the other side is vulnerable, right? So the earlier version of this work I did, actually, I remember giving a talk about it at Stanford in 2015. I had some data suggesting that there was a lot of people who typically vote for Democrats that had really right-wing views on immigration. And I was like, if candidates come around, like there's a lot of Democratic voters here who are like, really want really conservative immigration policy. And one of the responses I got is, well, if a candidate ever really went hard right on immigration, people would realize that's a terrible idea and that candidate would lose. And then 2016 happened. But I do think these issue views are real, and so I do think that idea of cross-pressure on individual issues is as old-fashioned as it sounds. I think there's very valid.
Let me ask you, now this is like a point of personal privilege as someone who works in the election law area. One of the big questions is about say the relationship of the primary system to polarization or extremity of candidates. And so if moderates are not really moderate, it may still be the case that, say, party members, if you have a closed primary, are going to produce more extreme candidates. Is that irrelevant to your story here? Is that consistent with it? So the idea is that if you limit your primary to, like in California, we have the top 2 primary where anybody's allowed to vote in anybody's primary, but part of the argument for primary reform is that closed primaries are going to produce extreme candidates. That's the way a lot of people talk about polarization in Congress. Is this that dynamic spoken to by your study here?
Yeah, so one way you could sort of think about it is that I think, as you get into the kind of people that are going to be the most diehard partisans vote in primaries, right? They're going to tend to be the folks who are, really, line up with their party on certain issues. They're going to enforce party discipline. Say that you, for whatever institutional reforms or, interventions or whatever it is, you kind of get the next tranche of people who are a little less interested in politics to vote in primaries. Like, how is that going to change things? And I think the answer is, on some issues, that's probably going to lead you more towards the center, but maybe on other issues, it's going to actually not have that effect, right? I think, and so this is actually what kind of got me interested in some of this work in the first place. Is when I first started doing this work, there was a lot of fervor for the idea that, well, in order to make politicians more moderate, we've got to kind of take the average person on the street and get them more political power because they want moderate policy. And I mean, I think on some issues that is probably true. But I do think on other issues, maybe that's kind of less true than we think. And there's plenty of issues, like if I scroll to the end where I showed you, and again, I'm just going to repeat the caveat again, this is not representative data, but in this particular data set we have, like on Social Security, for example, like a lot of voters would love to do things that would bankrupt the government. Because they're like, yeah, like free money sounds great, and like let's have the next generation pay for it. Like let's blow up the deficit and like give old people a lot of money. And I think there is, to some extent, like there is a Burkean undertone to this project in the sense of when you look at what public opinion actually is, you recognize that, well, there might be a kind of a role that I think the founders had in mind for this kind of balancing of, well, we want public input, but elites also are more expert. And they have to think about trade-offs that the average voter doesn't fully internalize. And that's part of why I'm not as much of a total enthusiast for kind of all reforms that would kind of increase power for voters, is the thought that, like, well, sometimes voters kind of want policies that we know for various reasons, like, we live in California, so we know this with our referendum system, like, might not lead to the outcomes that, voters and we all want, so.
So I want to open it in the room, but we've got several Zoom questions. Let me start with one of them. So to what extent is instability not instability, but actually political free will that reflects exposure to new experiences and information in the time between responses?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the tests that we do for this, and it was actually invented by Converse in the original essay on this stuff, is if you thought part of what's happening is, okay, say, in the 3 waves of the survey, between wave 1 and 2, something happens. Somebody, they retire, or they see a news article that really changes their view. There could be instability because there's this kind of like discontinuous jump that's going to reflect itself in waves 2 and 3. If that were the case, what you'd expect is that the correlation between people's views in wave 1 and 2, or 2 and 3, would be higher than the correlations between their views in wave 1 and wave 3. Because whatever the change is going to be reflected on wave 2 and 3, and not on wave 1. And just like Converse, we don't find that. So it seems like this instability is stuff that doesn't like stick over time.
Second Zoom question we got is about intensity of preference. So that it may be that these folks have extreme views or reflected in surveys, but do they actually feel intensely about the issue? So that, they may be just, whether it's unstable or even consistent, is that something that might vary depending on whether someone calls themselves a moderate or not?
Yeah, great question. So this is what that, so it's 2 answers to that. So one is, this is part of what that conjoint was trying to get at is, and it seems like people, when they're at least making these like trade-offs, kind of they weight their extreme views just as much. And when it comes to other actions, like, are people going to go out and like actually protest or something? That we don't have great measures of, although I haven't seen a lot of moderate protests before. This Conant Center doesn't have a lot of protests that they run. It tends to be more extreme groups, I think. So I think if anything, we're probably underweighting to what extent extreme views matter, which I think would make sense. But I do think issue importance is actually, when you think about it, a little bit more challenging to define conceptually than you might think. Because if I ask you, is like taxes or abortion more important to you? It sounds easy to answer, but it really depends on the alternatives, right? Like, if all of a sudden you'd say, okay, well, I think abortion is the most important issue to me, and then say that Congress were really going to vote on a plan to abolish all federal taxes, all of a sudden that issue might become really important to you because the potential change is a lot larger. So I think it's actually a little challenging to define in a precise way what issues matter most to people, without defining like how large the changes would be on each issue and making those comparable. But insofar as we have senses of it, defined in the mapping everything to the elite space in the same way, these extreme views seem to matter to people. Yeah.
So let me ask one last question, which has to do with, this is sort of a methods question. especially for those of us, we have a new polarization and social change lab, or that we've adopted, Rob Willer's lab that's moved into the Cyber Policy Center. And a lot of work done here on echo chambers, online, et cetera. One way that we measure this, we say, all right, are liberals in echo chambers online, are conservatives echo chambers online? Is that just faulty as a method to start tagging people that way, given what you've discovered here? And if it's the wrong way to think about, say, information consumption by tagging people with these ideological labels, how should we deal with it?
Thanks. That's a great question. So I think it is actually okay, I think. And that might be a surprising answer based on what I've said, but I think it's okay if you just bear in mind what those measures mean. So if we sort of do put people on one left to right wing line, and we say, okay, here's conservative, liberals, and then people in the middle, I actually don't have an objection to doing that as long as we interpret those measures as telling us how consistently liberal or consistently conservative someone is. I mean, basically what these measures are is they tell you on what share of issues does someone have a liberal view or a conservative view. And if you say, oh, like these are people for whom on 80% of issues they have conservative views, as long as we stop there and say, like, that's what defines this group, it's not the same 80% as each other. It doesn't mean that on those issues they are, a 0.8 out of, 1 or something. It is what it is. It means that and nothing more. They're conservative on 80% of issues. I think as long as you stop there, it's fine. I think what this project shows is the challenge is then when you want to leap from that to then making other inferences about them, then that gets trickier.
Well, thank you so much. This is a wonderful last seminar for our year, and please join me in thanking David Broockman. And so stay tuned for over the summer where we announce what our schedule is for the fall. Both the room and the time may change, but the answer may surprise you, as they say on the internet. So we'll see you in the fall, but thank you for all your participation in our seminar this year.